Imagine making decisions every day about money, relationships, health, believing you're in full control, using logic and reason. But what if I told you that your brain is secretly playing tricks on you? That the way you think, judge, and decide is often deeply flawed, even when you feel absolutely certain? This isn't just speculation, it's science. And it's the foundation of The Undoing Project, a book that tells the fascinating story of two men who changed the way we understand the human mind. Michael Lewis, the author of Moneyball and The Big Short, doesn't just give us a psychology lecture, he takes us on a journey through the lives of two Israeli psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, whose work shattered the long-held belief that humans are rational decision-makers. These two weren't just academics, they were intellectual explorers, uncovering hidden flaws in human judgment that affect everything from financial markets to medical diagnoses, military strategies to everyday choices. Their friendship was electric, two brilliant but completely different minds colliding in a way that would reshape economics, psychology, and even artificial intelligence. Tversky was the confident, quick-witted extrovert who could charm a room with his sharp insights. Kahneman, on the other hand, was deeply introspective, constantly questioning his own conclusions. Together, they uncovered something startling: our brains rely on shortcuts, mental rules of thumb called heuristics, which often lead to systematic errors in judgment. In simple terms, they prove that we're not as rational as we think we are. Consider this: imagine you're given two choices, option A, where you have a guaranteed $500, or option B, where you have a 50% chance to win $1,000 and a 50% chance to get nothing. Most people take the sure $500, even though, mathematically, both options are equal. Now, flip the scenario. If option A means losing $500 for sure, but option B gives you a 50% chance of losing nothing and a 50% chance of losing $1,000, most people suddenly prefer to gamble. Why? Because losses feel twice as painful as gains feel good. This is loss aversion, one of their most famous discoveries, and it explains so much about why people hold on to bad investments, avoid taking necessary risks, or make irrational choices under pressure. Their insights weren't just fascinating, they were revolutionary. Before them, economists believed that people always made logical decisions based on self-interest. Kahneman and Tversky blew that idea apart, showing how emotions, cognitive biases, and mental shortcuts lead to predictable mistakes. Their research paved the way for behavioral economics, a field that now influences everything from marketing to politics, health policies to game design. So, why does this matter to you? Because understanding how your brain works can help you make better decisions. Once you recognize these biases, you can start to counteract them. You can step back, question your instincts, and avoid falling into the same predictable traps. Whether it's negotiating a salary, making an investment, or even deciding what to eat for dinner, knowing how your mind tricks you is the first step in outsmarting it. But here's the twist: the very people who uncovered these flaws weren't immune to them either. And that, perhaps, is the most fascinating part of all. Have you ever been absolutely sure about something only to realize later that you were completely wrong? Maybe you were convinced a stock was going to skyrocket, only to watch it crash. Maybe you were certain you remembered a conversation one way, only to find out it never happened like that at all. The truth is, our brains are wired to make quick judgments, but those judgments are often deeply flawed. And that's exactly what Kahneman and Tversky set out to prove. One of their biggest discoveries was that the way we think isn't purely logical, it's shaped by hidden biases and mental shortcuts called heuristics. Think about how often we make snap judgments based on how things seem. If something looks like it fits a pattern we recognize, we assume it's more likely to be true. This is called the representativeness heuristic, and it messes with our judgment in powerful ways. Imagine meeting someone who is quiet, loves books, and enjoys being alone. Would you assume they're more likely to be a librarian or a salesperson? Most people immediately say, librarian, because that matches the stereotype. But statistically, there are far more salespeople than librarians, so the odds say otherwise. Our brains, however, don't think in probabilities, they think in patterns. And those patterns can lead us astray. Then there's the availability heuristic, which explains why we tend to judge risks based on what we can easily recall. If you see a plane crash on the news, you might suddenly feel like flying is dangerous even though, statistically, it's far safer than driving. The same thing happens with crime. If you hear about a break-in in your neighborhood, you might assume crime is increasing, even if the actual crime rate is going down. Your brain latches onto the most vivid examples and uses them to make general conclusions, whether they're accurate or not. Perhaps the most powerful idea in their research was loss aversion, the idea that losses feel twice as painful as equivalent gains feel good. This explains why people hold on to bad investments, refuse to cut their losses in business, or stay in unhappy situations longer than they should. If you've ever watched someone throw good money after bad in a casino, or kept a subscription going just because you already paid for it, you've experienced loss aversion firsthand. We don't just dislike losing, we go to extreme lengths to avoid it, even when it hurts us in the long run. This also connects to framing effects, another major finding. How a choice is presented can completely change how we perceive it. Take a simple medical decision. If a doctor tells you that a surgery has a 90% survival rate, you'll probably feel okay about it. But if they tell you there's a 10% chance of dying, suddenly it feels riskier, even though both statements mean exactly the same thing. Marketers, politicians, and even news headlines use this trick all the time to shape public opinion. The facts don't change, but the way they're framed influences how we react to them. And then there's the anchoring effect, which is one of the biggest reasons people make bad financial decisions. If I ask you whether Gandhi was older or younger than 114 when he died, then ask you to guess his actual age, your estimate will be higher than if I had asked whether he was older or younger than 35. Why? Because your brain clings to the first number it sees and adjusts from there, even if that number is completely irrelevant. That's why stores show the original price of an item next to the sale price to make the discount seem bigger. It's also why negotiations start with extreme offers, because the first number thrown out acts as an anchor, pulling everything else toward it. Their research wasn't just about quirky mental errors, it completely overturned the foundation of traditional economics. Economists had long assumed that people make rational decisions based on self-interest. Kahneman and Tversky showed that this simply wasn't true. People don't weigh costs and benefits logically, they're influenced by emotions, biases, and how choices are framed. Their findings led to the rise of behavioral economics, which now shapes policies on everything from retirement savings to healthcare. In fact, governments and businesses now design programs around human psychology. Automatic enrollment in 401k plans, for example, works because people tend to stick with default options rather than opting in on their own. That's behavioral economics in action. But what makes this story even more interesting is the dynamic between Kahneman and Tversky themselves. They weren't just two scientists working together, they were intellectual soulmates, challenging and pushing each other in ways that few partnerships ever do. Tversky was the brilliant showman, confident and charismatic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and command attention. Kahneman was more reserved, constantly questioning everything, including his own ideas. It was this tension that made their work so groundbreaking. Tversky would generate bold, sweeping theories, and Kahneman would poke holes in them, forcing them to refine their ideas until they were airtight. Their partnership, however, wasn't without its struggles. As their work gained recognition, Tversky became the face of their research, receiving most of the public credit. Kahneman, who had always struggled with self-doubt, found this painful. He knew they were equal partners, but the world didn't always see it that way. The tension grew, and over time, their friendship became strained. By the time Tversky was diagnosed with cancer, they had drifted apart. When he died in 1996, Kahneman was devastated. A few years later, he won the Nobel Prize in Economics not as a tribute to their partnership, but because their ideas had fundamentally changed the field. It was a bittersweet moment, a recognition of their brilliance but also a reminder of what had been lost. This book isn't just about psychology or economics, it's about what it means to be human. It shows us that even the smartest people in the world aren't immune to bias. Even the very scientists who uncovered these flaws fell victim to them. Kahneman himself admitted that knowing about biases doesn't make you immune to them, it just makes you slightly better at catching them. And that's the real lesson here. Awareness is the first step to better decision-making, but it's not a cure. So what can we take away from all this? First, question your own certainty. When you feel 100% sure about something, pause and ask yourself, could I be falling into a mental trap? Second, challenge the way choices are framed, especially when money, risk, or emotions are involved. Are you making a decision based on the facts, or based on how those facts were presented to you? And finally, recognize that you're human. You will make mistakes. But the more you understand how your mind works, the better you can protect yourself from the biases that lead you astray. Have you ever looked back on a decision and thought, what was I thinking? Maybe you spent way too much on something you didn't really need, or you held on to a bad investment because you couldn't accept the loss. Or maybe you made a quick assumption about someone that turned out to be completely wrong. The frustrating truth is that our brains aren't built for perfect decision-making, they're built for survival, for efficiency, for shortcuts. Kahneman and Tversky showed us just how often these mental shortcuts lead us astray. But here's the good news. Once you understand the traps, you can start avoiding them. You might not be able to rewire your brain, but you can outthink it. The first step is recognizing and challenging your biases. Think about how often we make decisions on autopilot, trusting our instincts without questioning where they come from. If you've ever fallen for a limited time offer, or felt pressure to act fast before an opportunity disappears, you've been nudged by a psychological bias called urgency framing. Marketers use it all the time because they know it works. When we feel rushed, we don't analyze our choices as carefully. The trick is to pause. When you feel yourself making a snap judgment, ask yourself, am I making this choice because I've thought it through, or because my brain is taking a shortcut? If you're about to buy something because it's on sale for today only, step back and ask if you'd want it at full price. If you're drawn to an investment just because everyone else is jumping in, remind yourself that popularity doesn't equal value. Another key to better decision-making is understanding how framing influences our choices. Imagine you're at the doctor's office and they tell you that a procedure has a 90% success rate. That sounds reassuring, right? But if they instead said it has a 10% failure rate, you might feel more nervous even though it's the exact same information. The way a choice is presented changes how we perceive it. This happens everywhere, from news headlines to political debates to business pitches. Companies don't say, you're overpaying for this, they say, you're getting a special deal. Politicians don't say, we're cutting funding, they say, we're reallocating resources. Once you start looking for it, you'll see framing everywhere. And when you do, ask yourself, would I feel the same way if this were worded differently? Strip away the spin and focus on the raw facts before making a choice. One of the biggest decision-making mistakes we make is holding on to things simply because we already invested in them. This is called the sunk cost fallacy, and it keeps people stuck in bad situations for far too long. Think about someone staying in a miserable job because they've already put in 10 years, or a person refusing to quit a movie halfway through just because they paid for the ticket. The money, the time, the effort, those things are gone no matter what. The only question that matters is this worth continuing? If the answer is no, cut your losses. Kahneman and Tversky found that people tend to overvalue what they already own, which is why we overprice things we want to sell or keep items we don't even use. The trick is to detach yourself emotionally and think like an outsider. If you wouldn't buy that thing today at its current price, it's probably not worth holding on to. Another huge cognitive trap is overconfidence. People tend to believe they know more than they actually do, which leads to risky bets, failed businesses, and bad predictions. One of the most famous studies found that when people say they're 100% sure about something, they're actually wrong about 20% of the time. Think about that 1 in 5 times, absolute certainty turns out to be completely misplaced. So how do you protect yourself from overconfidence? Start by forcing yourself to consider the opposite. If you're convinced an investment is a sure win, ask yourself, what's the strongest argument against it? If you're certain a decision will go your way, look for reasons it might not. The simple act of considering an alternative weakens the illusion of certainty and makes your decision more balanced. Another way to outsmart your brain is to slow down when making important choices. Quick decisions are necessary in emergencies, but most of life's biggest mistakes happen because people don't take the time to weigh their options. If you're about to make a major financial, career, or personal decision, force yourself to step away for a while. Sleep on it, gather more information, get another perspective. Kahneman himself admitted that even though he studied decision-making for decades, he still felt the pull of cognitive biases. His solution? A structured approach. Instead of making decisions based on gut feelings, he looked at the data, weighed probabilities, and considered the possible consequences before acting. You can do the same. Whether it's negotiating a salary, buying a house, or choosing a career move, take your time. A rushed decision is rarely the best one. And speaking of better choices, one of the simplest and most powerful ways to make smarter decisions is to focus on long-term consequences rather than short-term emotions. Humans are wired for immediate gratification. That's why it's so easy to overspend, procrastinate, or put off difficult conversations. But when you stop and ask yourself, how will this choice affect me in a year? You get a very different perspective. Would future you be glad you made this decision, or regret it? Research shows that when people shift their thinking to the long term, they make far better choices. So the next time you're tempted by something impulsive, fast forward in your mind. Picture yourself a year from now looking back. Would you be happy with what you did? Another essential strategy is surrounding yourself with people who challenge your thinking. We naturally seek out opinions that confirm what we already believe, a bias known as confirmation bias. But if you only listen to people who agree with you, you miss out on different perspectives and better solutions. Kahneman and Tversky's entire partnership worked because they challenged each other constantly. If Tversky had an idea, Kahneman would try to poke holes in it, and vice versa. That's how they refined their theories and made them bulletproof. You can do the same in your life. Seek out people who aren't afraid to challenge your views. When you have a big decision to make, ask for opinions from people with different perspectives, not just those who will tell you what you want to hear. And finally, accept that you will make mistakes. The goal isn't to eliminate errors entirely. That's impossible. The goal is to reduce them, to become aware of them, and to learn from them. Kahneman and Tversky's work didn't just expose human flaws, it gave us a roadmap for better thinking. If you can recognize when your brain is taking shortcuts, if you can question the way choices are framed, if you can force yourself to slow down and consider alternatives, you will make better decisions. Not perfect ones, but better ones. And over time, that makes all the difference. So the next time you feel absolutely certain about something, pause. The next time you feel the urge to act fast, take a step back. The next time you're about to hold on to something just because you've already invested in it, let it go. Your brain is a powerful tool, but it also has blind spots. The more you learn to see them, the better choices you'll make, and that is the real power of the Undoing Project. Have you ever learned something new, some fascinating insight about human behavior and thought, wow, now that I know this, I'll never make that mistake again? Maybe you read about cognitive biases, how they trick us into bad decisions, and you felt a sense of control. You figured that simply being aware of these biases would protect you from falling into the same traps. But here's the uncomfortable truth, it won't. This is perhaps the greatest blind spot of all, the belief that knowledge alone is enough to change behavior. Kahneman himself, despite spending his entire life studying biases, admitted that he still fell victim to them. He once described how he would warn students about the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate how long projects take. He knew this bias well, had studied it extensively, and even identified it in others. And yet, time and time again, he found himself making the same mistakes, setting unrealistic timelines, assuming things would go smoothly, and getting blindsided when they didn't. Knowing about a bias doesn't mean you can avoid it. The brain isn't like a computer where a software update fixes a glitch. These biases are hardwired into us, built into the very way we process the world. You can't just turn them off. Loss aversion, for example, the tendency to feel losses more strongly than gains, will always exist. You might recognize it in the moment, but when faced with a difficult decision, your emotions will still push you to avoid loss at all costs. The same goes for overconfidence, anchoring, and confirmation bias. Even when you think you're being objective, your brain is subtly guiding you toward what feels right, rather than what is actually true. This is why experience alone doesn't always lead to better decision-making. People assume that after years in a field, whether it's business, medicine, or investing, they'll naturally become wiser, immune to poor judgment. But that's not always the case. Many professionals make the same mistakes over and over, because they rely on intuition rather than actively correcting for biases. A doctor with decades of experience might still misdiagnose a patient based on a recent, vivid case. A stock trader might still be swayed by hype, despite knowing the dangers of herd mentality. So if knowledge isn't enough, what is? The real key is creating systems that force you to think differently. This is why checklists are so effective in medicine and aviation. They counteract overconfidence by requiring people to slow down and verify each step. It's why smart investors set predetermined rules for selling stocks, rather than relying on gut feelings in the moment. It's why structured decision-making, like considering alternative viewpoints, weighing probabilities, and using data, leads to better outcomes. The biggest mistake you can make after learning about biases is assuming you're now above them. The reality is, you're not. But if you accept that, if you stay skeptical of your own thinking, if you build safeguards into your decisions, you can at least catch yourself before falling too deep. That's the real lesson of the Undoing Project, not that we can erase our blind spots, but that we can learn to work around them. At its core, the Undoing Project isn't just about two psychologists or the science of decision-making, it's about what it means to be human. Kahneman and Tversky didn't just uncover flaws in our thinking, they revealed the hidden forces shaping our choices, the unconscious biases that guide our lives without us even realizing it. And perhaps the most humbling realization is that no one, not even the people who discovered these biases, is immune to them. But that doesn't mean we're powerless. While we can't rewire our brains, we can change how we approach decisions. We can slow down, challenge our assumptions, and use systems to keep our biases in check. The key isn't to aim for perfect rationality, that's impossible, but to be just a little bit less wrong, a little bit more aware of how our minds trick us. Because over time, those small improvements add up. So the next time you're faced with a big decision, ask yourself, am I choosing this because it's truly the best option, or because my brain is taking a shortcut? The answer might surprise you. And that's the beauty of what Kahneman and Tversky taught us, not just how we fail, but how we can learn to fail a little bit better.